There is a specific kind of institutional failure that is more dangerous than incompetence. Incompetence produces wrong conclusions from inadequate analysis. This other failure produces wrong conclusions from correct analysis, by building a system in which the correct conclusions cannot be heard by the people who need to act on them. The American intelligence apparatus in Vietnam in 1967 and 1968 was not incompetent. Its collection systems were functioning. Its analysts were producing accurate assessments. Its warning signals before the Tet Offensive were real, specific, and timely. What the apparatus could not overcome was the incentive structure that surrounded it. A command and political environment that had organized itself around a narrative of progress that accurate intelligence was incompatible with, and that had therefore, incrementally and without any single explicit decision to do so, reorganized the flow of intelligence to protect the narrative rather than to inform the command. The Tet Offensive was not predicted and ignored because the warning went unnoticed. It was predicted and ignored because noticing it would have required admitting something that the entire American war management apparatus had spent 3 years making it professionally dangerous to admit. Understanding what that admission would have required means understanding what the progress narrative actually was and how it had been constructed. By 1967, the United States had approximately 500,000 military personnel in South Vietnam. It had spent billions of dollars on military operations, infrastructure, and economic development programs. It had fought hundreds of significant engagements against North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces. It had produced, from all of these activities, no territorial advance, no measurable improvement in South Vietnamese government stability, and no visible reduction in the enemy's ability to recruit, supply, and field fighting forces. The conventional metrics of military success, ground taken, objectives secured, enemy capacity durably reduced, did not apply to the Vietnam War in any way that produced results the American public or Congress could be shown as evidence of progress. The body count was the solution to this measurement problem. If you could not show progress by territory controlled, you could show it by enemy killed. If you could calculate the rate at which American operations were killing North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, and compare that rate to the enemy's estimated recruitment and reinforcement capacity, you could construct a mathematical narrative of progress that pointed toward a crossover point at which the enemy's losses would permanently exceed his replacements, and his military capacity would begin declining. The crossover point was not a battlefield reality. It was a statistical argument. And like all statistical arguments, it was entirely dependent on the accuracy of the baseline data from which the projections were made. If the body count figures were inflated, the crossover point calculation was wrong. If the enemy force size was underestimated, the crossover point calculation was wrong. If both were true simultaneously, the entire progress narrative was not just wrong, but inverted. The war that was being presented as approaching a successful conclusion might actually be approaching the opposite. Both were true simultaneously, and a CIA analyst named Sam Adams spent most of 1967 trying to get someone with the authority to act on it to listen. Adams's job was enemy order of battle, estimating the actual size of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that American and South Vietnamese troops were facing. His methodology was sound, and his data sources were multiple and independent. Captured documents, prisoner interrogations, signals intelligence, defector reporting. All of them were converging on an estimate of enemy force strength that was roughly double the official MAC-V figure. MAC-V was reporting approximately 300,000 enemy fighters. Adams's analysis pointed towards 600,000, potentially higher when irregular and support forces were fully counted. The implications of Adams's estimate were not subtle. If the enemy force was 600,000 rather than 300,000, then the body count figures that MACV was presenting as evidence of progress were evidence of something else entirely. That American forces were killing enemy fighters at a rate that looked impressive against a falsified baseline, and was actually insufficient to reduce a force twice as large as the official count claimed. The crossover point had not been reached. The enemy's capacity was not declining. The progress narrative was not a miscalculation or an analytical error. It was a mathematical impossibility, constructed on a deliberately falsified foundation. Adams brought this conclusion to MACV in mid-1967. The response from MACV's intelligence staff was not to examine his methodology and identify its errors. The response was to tell him that his estimates could not be accepted because accepting them would require reporting to Washington that the enemy force was twice as large as previously stated, which would raise questions about every progress report that had been submitted for the past 2 years. The Order of Battle conference that took place in August and September 1967, at which MACV and CIA analysts attempted to reconcile their enemy strength estimates, is one of the most thoroughly documented examples of institutional data suppression in the history of American intelligence. MACV's position throughout the conference was explicit. Regardless of what the raw data showed, the official enemy strength figure could not exceed 300,000, because a figure higher than that would be politically unacceptable. The word politically was used. The constraint was not analytical. It was not a disagreement about methodology or source reliability. It was an explicit statement that the data would be adjusted to fit the politically acceptable conclusion, rather than the conclusion adjusted to fit the data. Adams eventually took his case to the CIA's leadership and then to the Johnson administration's national security apparatus. At each level, the response was the same. The MACV numbers were the official numbers. The official numbers would not be changed. The progress narrative would be maintained. This is the context in which the January 1968 intelligence warnings about the Tet Offensive arrived. They arrived into a system that had spent the better part of a year demonstrating its willingness to suppress accurate intelligence in favor of institutional convenience. The January 5th captured document describing plans for attacks on South Vietnamese cities landed on desks at MACV headquarters, where the analytical framework for processing it had been corrupted by the Order of Battle dispute. The signals intelligence showing unusual patterns of North Vietnamese movement and communication in January 1968 was being processed by analysts who were operating in an environment that had made it professionally dangerous to draw conclusions incompatible with the progress narrative. The warning intelligence was not missing. It was present, and it was specific. What was missing was the institutional capacity to act on it honestly. General Westmoreland's fixation on Khe Sanh was the operational expression of this analytical failure. The Marine Fire Base in the Northwest was under genuine North Vietnamese pressure in January 1968, and Westmoreland's concern about a Dien Bien Phu scenario was not irrational given the visible enemy buildup. But the intelligence pointing toward urban attacks was not pointing toward Khe Sanh. It was pointing toward the cities. Westmoreland's decision to treat the Khe Sanh buildup as the primary threat and the urban warning intelligence as secondary was not made because the Khe Sanh evidence was stronger. It was made because the Khe Sanh scenario fit within the existing operational framework, a conventional military confrontation in the field where American firepower advantage was decisive, while the urban scenario implied something that the entire progress narrative was structured to deny: that the enemy had the capacity, the organization, and the political infrastructure to simultaneously attack the symbolic and administrative heart of South Vietnamese society across the entire country. Accepting the urban attack intelligence at face value would have required accepting that the Viet Cong infrastructure, the political and logistical network that Sam Adams had correctly estimated at twice the official size, was capable of coordinating and supplying a nationwide offensive simultaneously. It would have required acknowledging that the pacification programs, the Hamlet security initiatives, the years of counterinsurgency operations that MACV had been presenting as evidence of progress in denying the enemy his base of support among the population, had not worked. The cities were full of people who had not been secured. The enemy had access to them. The 3 years of progress reports were producing a situation in which more than 100 American and South Vietnamese installations could be attacked simultaneously by forces that the official order of battle said did not exist in sufficient numbers to attempt it. The failure of intelligence distribution in the weeks before Tet compounded the analytical failure. Even the warning intelligence that had penetrated the filtering process at MACV headquarters was not being distributed to the commanders responsible for defending the cities. The sharing protocols between American and South Vietnamese commands were inadequate. The warning that reached MACV's intelligence staff in Saigon was not being passed to the field commanders in forms that allowed defensive preparation. The commanders at Hue, at Da Nang, at the provincial capitals that would be attacked on January 30th and 31st were not receiving intelligence that told them to expect simultaneous coordinated attacks on urban centers during the Tet ceasefire period. They were receiving operational guidance that reflected Westmoreland's focus on Khe Sanh and the conventional threat in the field. The distribution failure ensured that even the partial truth that had survived the suppression process at the command level did not reach the people who needed it in time to act. What the Tet Offensive destroyed in January and February of 1968 was not primarily military. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces that launched the attacks were largely annihilated in the fighting. Every city that was attacked was retaken. Hue, which fell and was held for 25 days, was recovered at brutal cost. In military terms, Tet was a decisive American and South Vietnamese tactical victory. The Viet Cong infrastructure that Sam Adams had spent 1967 trying to get MACV to correctly count was decimated by the exposure the offensive created. But the political and strategic consequences of Tet were determined not by the military outcome, but by the gap it revealed between the official narrative and the operational reality. The American public in February 1968 was not primarily responding to the military results of the Tet Offensive. They were responding to the evidence that they had been lied to. The progress narrative that the Johnson administration and MACV had been selling for 3 years, the crossover point, the body count statistics, the light at the end of the tunnel, had produced a public expectation about the state of the war that was incompatible with images of Viet Cong fighters inside the walls of the American embassy in Saigon. The gap between the expectation and the image was not bridgeable by explanation or context. It was the kind of gap that destroys institutional credibility permanently because it suggests not error, but deception. And deception, once established as a hypothesis, is self-reinforcing in every subsequent communication from the institution accused of it. Johnson announced he would not seek re-election on March 31, 1968. The political will to sustain the American commitment in Vietnam, which had survived years of escalating casualties and inconclusive results, did not survive the revelation that the inconclusive results had been systematically misrepresented as progress. The war continued for 7 more years, but the political foundation that had supported the American role in it was broken on the morning of January 31, 1968, not by North Vietnamese military power, but by the distance between what the American government had said and what the cameras showed. That distance had been created, maintained, and protected by 3 years of institutional decisions about which intelligence to act on and which intelligence to file. The January 5th document was not the warning that was ignored. It was the last in a sequence of warnings that had been filtered through an apparatus designed to protect a story. When the story broke, everything built on it broke with it. The cost was not measured in the battles lost at Tet, because the battles at Tet were won. It was measured in the political capacity to continue a war that had been sold on premises that January 31, 1968, made permanently indefensible.